Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, as many of you are well aware, I'm very proud of Ohio and its history, but we are not without our very dark moments in our history. And before Ohio was even a state, when we were still a part of the frontier during the American Revolution, one of those darkest chapters took place. I had the privilege a number of years ago to actually attend. I was on staff for a week of our church camp, and we did, it was kind of a fine arts camp where people with talents like acting and singing and playing music and things like that would come, and we would kind of just do things related to their talents. And one of the things we did was we took kind of a field trip from camp to go see the living history acting out of what is known as the Gnadenhutten Massacre. Now, today, the town isn't called Gnadenhutten. That's what it was called at the time this happened. I believe they say Gnadenhutten now or something like that. It's about an hour and a half from where I live is where this took place. But it was a massacre of Christians, Moravian Indians, who were peaceful and weren't doing anything to anyone and didn't fight back when it happened, and they were massacred by American patriots. It's a really dark chapter in our history, and I'm so glad that Extra History has chosen to cover the Gnadenhutten Massacre. I am going to call it that just because it's what I've always called it, because I know that's historically what it was called. I'm sure they'll probably maybe use the more modern pronunciation, but we're going to take a look at the story today, and I'll put the link in the description. This video only came out a couple weeks ago, so if you haven't already seen it on their channel, I would encourage you to check out not only this video, but many of their other videos as well, so we can support them and just continue to encourage them to make fantastic original content that tells stories we need to learn from history. Let's dive into the American Revolution's forgotten war crime.
Outside Gnadenhutten, Ohio, March 6, 1782. While out looking for a stray horse, a young man named Joseph Shibosh comes across an unexpected sight. A group of drenched men, strangers, have just swum across the river, and they're armed. Recognizing them as Pennsylvanian militia, no friend of native people, Shibosh turns to run back to Gnadenhutten. He has to warn his friends and family. A musket ball shatters Shibosh's arm. Moaning, he drags himself into the bushes, but the militia drag him back out. Shibosh pleads for his life, saying he was just looking for his horse. He also tells them that he's part white. His father is a preacher who ministers to the native village, but it's no use. The militia beat him to death, scalp him, and leave his mutilated body by the roadside. No one will warn the peaceful villagers of Gnadenhutten. Prejudice and death will arrive unannounced.
So a couple things I want to say right off the bat. Number one, a lot of people think that the American Revolutionary War ended at Yorktown in October of 1781. It did not. It ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And the major fighting by the big armies ended at Yorktown, but there were still fighting, especially on the frontier. You're going to have, in fact, my sixth great-grandfather was a lieutenant who was killed at the Battle of Blue Licks, Kentucky, which happened in 1782. There was still fighting going on. John Laurens, great friend to Alexander Hamilton, one of the characters in the Hamilton musical, was killed after Yorktown in a skirmish with British soldiers down in South Carolina. So fighting continued, and fighting on the frontier was very often between American frontiersmen, Daniel Boone, people like that, who was at the Battle of Blue Licks, and allied tribes who were allied with the British government, who was much more friendly to the native tribes than the Americans were. So all of that plays into this. We also need to acknowledge that very often the natives had perpetrated some pretty horrible things on settlers. There's a lot of stories even in the pre-war years of massacres of civilians on frontier towns. So it happened on both sides. So let's acknowledge all of that. What happens here is going to end up being a response to something that the Native Americans did, but it gets taken out on people who had nothing to do with it.
Want to see the first episode of our new Napoleon in Egypt series immediately after watching this episode 2 full weeks early? Well, with Nebula First, you can. Learn how after the episode. The American Revolution was a murky and deeply violent conflict, though that particular aspect of it is often removed from American films and textbooks in a quest for a more palatable narrative of its founding. But we're not going to do that here today. So in the interest of countering that sanitized version of history, just be aware that this episode is going to be more violent and emotionally charged than usual.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, please take care of yourself, and viewer discretion is advised. During the American Revolution, the regular armies of both Crown and Congress committed massacres upon one another. During clashes like Poloi Tavern, Old Tapan, and Waxhaws, for example, British soldiers engaged in excessive bloodshed.
Absolutely. Tapan Massacre, for example, another one of my ancestors. You hear me talk about my ancestors all the time. I don't have any more connections to these events than anybody else does. It's just that I've been doing research for so long that I know all of mine. But one of my ancestors, his name was Charles Swan. He was in that Continental Dragoon unit that was massacred at Tapan. Only a few of them survived. He was lucky to be one of them. There were massacres on both sides. There were a lot of examples of patriots, patriot militia, like in the Carolinas in particular. This was very much a civil war. You had Americans fighting Americans, Americans that were on the patriot side, Americans that were on the loyalist side, and they fought each other. And very often, if you got captured, you got executed. They didn't mess around with keeping prisoners. It was violent. It was ugly. It was very intimate in the way that it was ugly.
Against the defeated Continental Army. Similarly, at Haw River and in the aftermath of the Battle of Kings Mountain, revolutionary forces showed little hesitation when killing prisoners of war, especially when those surrendering were Americans still loyal to Britain. But all of those incidents were military-on-military violence, often committed during or just after combat. And in some cases, the line between successful military operation and massacre could be a blurred one, with the defeated crying foul while the victors claimed they did nothing beyond the rules of war. The revolutionaries in particular were excellent at covering up military failings with accounts of British brutality, winning the propaganda war, and attracting sympathy and recruits.
So you have to understand that it's easy for us to judge this stuff, and I'm not trying to say that we should excuse these massacres at all. But you have to understand that when we're sitting in the comfort of our homes, far from the violence of events like this, it is easy to say, man, I'd never do something like that. But when your friends have been killed, when you have seen firsthand what other sides have done, when you have gotten desensitized to killing other human beings because you've been fighting in a war for years, the mindset is very, very different.
There were times, however, when this extreme violence did spill over beyond the battlefield. Civilians, whether pro-revolution, loyalist, or neutral, suffered a great deal during the war, from theft and forced eviction to assault and rape. Though it should be noted that cases of civilians being outright killed were thankfully rare, there were exceptions, the worst of which ranks as the bloodiest and most brutal massacre of the American Revolution. Now, overall, Native American tribes arguably drew the shortest of many short straws in the conflict. Faced with siding either with King George or the rebelling American colonists, most chose to back the British. But many others, such as the Lenape tribe, tried to remain neutral and avoid the war altogether.
So Lenape, sometimes known as the Delaware Indians, again, I know this because I'm descended from some of them. They originally are kind of in the area that today would be Philadelphia and that part of Pennsylvania. And down into Delaware, but as with a lot of things, as white people from Europe have settled, they've kind of been pushed further and further west. And at this point now, they're in kind of western PA, Ohio, West Virginia, those areas, sometimes called the Lenni Lenape, but more often not, they're called Delaware Indians. Understand with all of this that as we're talking about the reasons that the Native Americans side with the British, a lot of it has to do, and this is one of the reasons for the war too. The Appalachian Mountains are kind of the natural western border of the British colonies in America, the 13 colonies. Whereas as more and more people are settling in America, they're looking west at all of that land that is, in their mind, just empty. There are French fur trappers, there are, British and American hunters that go in there. There are some forts here and there, but for the most part, it's empty, except for all those pesky Native Americans that are there in their mind. So the Americans want to spread west, but the British have got these agreements in place not to allow that. And so it's natural for the Native Americans to want to side with the British in all of this.
In fact, the Lenape's trouble actually predated the Revolution, and in the wake of the French and Indian War, many were forced to move west and settle in Ohio. Among these displaced Lenape were a subset who had converted to a denomination of Czech Protestantism called the Moravian Church, which preached a strict adherence to pacifism. These villages, which colonists referred to as Moravian Indians or Christian Indians, had actually already come into conflict with American colonists when they'd resisted pressure to join the French and Indian War. And when the Revolution broke out, some Moravians thought that now residing outside of the colonies might actually help keep them safe, but they were sadly mistaken. Because it turned out that the Lenape's new home put them in the middle of no man's land between the Revolution's frontier headquarters at Fort Pitt and the British garrison at Fort Detroit.
Which, Pittsburgh and Detroit. So if you're looking at a map, that's what you're dealing with. And where is Gnadenhutten? It's right in the middle.
Finally forced to pick sides, the wider Lenape tribe split between the British and revolutionaries, while the Moravian faction, hewing to their pacifist beliefs, refused to take up arms for either side. Tragically, rather than this removing them from the conflict, it simply meant that the Moravians now became targets for both factions. In September of 1781, natives allied to the British forced the Moravians to move their settlement closer to Detroit, where the British could keep an eye on them and ensure they weren't aiding the revolutionaries. However, once that was implemented, food began to run out, and then to avoid the possibility of the Moravians starving, the British permitted them to return to their original villages. These movements, unsurprisingly, convinced revolutionaries that the Moravians were secretly aiding the British, so in March of 1782, a force of revolutionary frontier militia from Pennsylvania marched on the Moravian village of Gnadenhutten.
So it was impossible in their minds to believe that these people could be neutral, could be pacifists. In their minds, everybody has to be on a side. And that's one of the unfortunate assumptions that gets made here is that, well, if they're not fighting with us, they must be fighting against us.
Brutally murdering the first Moravian they encountered, Joseph Shibash. Upon arriving at Gnadenhutten, after the militiamen trampled the Moravians' crops, they told the villagers that they were here to help, claiming that their mission was to move the village to Fort Pitt in order to protect them from the British. The Moravians then fed them and agreed to give up what few weapons they possessed, and after the militia gathered more Moravians from a neighboring village, they then revealed their true intention. First, they bound the Moravians and separated the men from the women and children, confining them in separate houses. Then that evening, in an ironic reflection of their revolutionary beliefs, the 160 militiamen held a vote on whether or not to kill their captives. Only 18 voted against the measure. When the militia informed the Moravians of their decision, they found the natives still unwilling to resist, their only request being that the militia give them the night to prepare themselves for death.
So what you have here are these Native American Christians who are acting so much more like Christians than the European British Americans who claim to be Christians, most of them. It's really quite something, and as a Christian myself, I mean, I see these people as martyrs, I really do.
To which the militia agreed. So as the Moravians spent their last hours praying and singing hymns, the militiamen looted their homes and got drunk on stolen communion wine. Then when the sun rose, the killing began. March 8th, 1782. As the bound Moravians pray, the militia enter the two buildings and without pause begin to commit murder. The frontiersmen use mallets, hatchets, and knives, pulverizing skulls and then scalping their victims, regardless of age or gender. And throughout it all, the helpless Moravians continue to say prayers, some even asking God to forgive their killers even as they lay dying. But the militia showed them no mercy. Men, women, children were all indiscriminately bludgeoned and scalped before the bodies were dumped into the mission building. Afterward, they torched the village.
They're being pretty generous, too, as far as what they're choosing to describe in this, because they also dragged many of the women and children out into fields and raped them before torturing and murdering them. This was not just a simple execution. This was brutality on a scale that we can't even wrap our minds around.
And there are accounts of this. One militiaman, Nathan Rollins, whose father and uncle were killed by a different native tribe, personally slaughters 19 Moravians. Then afterward, he sits down and, weeping, admits that it was no satisfaction for the loss of his father and uncle at all.
No. Brutally murdering innocent people does not make you feel better about what happened to your family. And it's important to note, too, that the people who voted against this, remember there was a vote that they had, right? And some of the militiamen voted against killing them, did not participate in this and intentionally kind of went away from all of this.
Another account recalls how the, quote, dreadful work of human slaughter continued until every prayer and moan and sigh was hushed in the stillness of death. In total, 28 men, 29 women, and 39 children were murdered. Only 2 children, one of whom had been scalped, actually survived. One played dead before slipping away, while the other hid in a cellar before escaping the burning building. One of the few militiamen who'd refused to take part in the killings later adopted one of these survivors. Now, as news of the massacre spread, some colonial Americans denounced the act. However, most either voiced no opinion or backed the actions of the militia, and no criminality or wrongdoing was ever assigned to the killers.
Yeah, so the guy who commanded this is a guy named David Williamson. He was in command of the expedition, and he himself escaped any retribution for it. But George Washington even kind of was aware of all of this and ordered Americans on the frontier not to be taken alive because they knew that while the Moravians weren't going to do anything, there were plenty of Lenape Indians who were not Christians, who were not pacifists, who were going to get revenge for this. And there are accounts, I think there was the Crawford expedition, there are accounts of some absolute just horrifying brutality inflicted on Americans in retaliation for this.
Benjamin Franklin summed up the attitude when he wrote of his infinite pain and vexation on the matter, whilst still laying the blame upon King George. However, despite his supposed regret for the massacre itself, Franklin was also printing false newspaper articles claiming that the British paid Native American bounties for colonial scalps. Stories that encouraged violence toward Native peoples.
Yeah.
And though the Siege of Yorktown in 1781 had ended major fighting on the eastern seaboard, the revolutionary conflict on the frontiers continued and actually became worse in late 1782 and 1783. Word of the events at Janadenhutton encouraged natives to take up arms and mount retaliatory strikes. Incidents of torturing and killing prisoners increased, and one captured Continental Army officer, William Crawford, falsely accused of being present during the massacre, was beaten, shot, mutilated, and scalped before being killed. While 1783 marked the formal end of the American Revolution, Native tribes continued the struggle as the United States focused its efforts on Western expansion. Violent frontier conflicts with the new republic continued throughout the 1780s and 90s, many of which fed in part by the memory of the slaughter at Janadenhutton. Today, figures like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, or events like the Siege of Yorktown occupy the front and center of American historical memory, whereas killings like Janadenhutton or the many other frontier murders and massacres during the Revolution are often forgotten or at best relegated to footnotes. But doing that is an egregious mistake, because the birth of the United States cannot truly be understood unless it's viewed in its entirety, and that does include its uglier truths.
100% true. We should not fall into the trap of believing that any nation is innocent of its dark moments, right? You know, we love to point fingers at what bad things other nations have done. That does not excuse us from looking at ourselves. And I can be proud of my country, but also recognize that my country has done some horrible things, and my countrymen have done horrible things, and things like this really did happen, and we can acknowledge that.
In fact, it's the parts of history that people wish had never happened that are often the parts that need to be the most keenly remembered, because otherwise, the stories we tell ourselves about the origins of our current world risk becoming mere comforting fables, rather than being the important and just deeply culturally expensive lessons that we can all learn from so that the same mistakes are never made again. I mean, that's a huge part in why we feel it's necessary to create episodes like the one you just watched in the first place, even though there's always a very real chance that they'll be demonetized due to their subject matter. But thankfully, we can more confidently take these swings as a studio, since we no longer are totally beholden to the YouTube algorithm and know our episodes will always play without restrictions over on Nebula.
So, yeah, and this actually brings up a greater question that I know that some other history channels have been dealing with, like my friend JD at the History Underground, telling these incredibly important stories of history, but dealing with the way YouTube demonetizes many of those things. He had a real struggle with a bunch of his videos from Bavaria, where he was talking about the rise of National Socialism. And we have to be careful. The reason I always say National Socialism instead of that other word that we know that by is because I know that saying that word makes it more likely that my video is going to be restricted. And if it gets restricted, then not as many people see it, and that means not as many people are learning about these important, darker chapters of history. So I'm glad they told this story. I think we need more stories like this. And I'm going to look for an opportunity to drive down to Gnadenhutten, as they say it today, Gnadenhutten, and it's only an hour and a half drive for me. I could go down some morning and just do some content from there and show you the sites where these things really took place. Thanks for watching.